The House of Commons has adjourned for the summer, and it's widely suspected that the Prime Minister may call an election before Parliament returns in September. So what better time to take stock of what has been achieved and what hasn't, the highs and the lows, and the political landscape as federal politicians gear up for a possible election. To do that, I'm joined by three members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Kristy Kirkup is a parliamentary reporter for the Globe and Mail. Kady O'Malley is a regular contributor to iPolitics. And Tonda MacCharles is joining us. She's a parliamentary reporter for the Toronto Star. All three of you, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, let's start with, when I first framed this question about the biggest disappointment or the least performing minister, I don't think any of us would have said or would have thought of Carolyn Bennett. And yet today, here we are, and we're hearing for calls for her resignation. I want to hear what you make of it, and how does it relate to who you think has been the government's least successful minister. Let's start with you, Kristy.
Yeah, I think that I'm actually quite surprised, given the fact that Carolyn Bennett is a veteran politician, the fact that she essentially walked into this controversy and decided that she was going to text Jody Wilson-Raybould. Jody Wilson-Raybould told me yesterday that she actually hasn't heard, by text message anyway, from Carolyn Bennett since December of 2018. And then she reached out in this way and asked again about her pension. And of course, Jody Wilson-Raybould immediately said that this was racist and completely unacceptable. So, again, Carolyn Bennett is a very experienced minister, has worked very hard on the Indigenous Affairs file. I've covered her on it for several years. And the fact that she walked into this controversy, again, I thought it was out of character for her, frankly, just because she has been around a long time. I'm not surprised, though, that the Prime Minister is standing by her because, again, she has worked very closely with a number of communities on this particular file with respect to Crown Indigenous relations. And at this moment in the country, I don't think the Prime Minister is looking to usher his Indigenous Affairs or Crown Indigenous Relations Minister aside.
So how does that relate then to who you would choose as being the most disappointing or the least performing minister?
You know, I think that for me, I've covered the sexual misconduct controversy for several months now, and there have been lots of questions from opposition parties, calls for Harjit Sajjan, the defense minister's resignation. And I think, frankly, Harjit Sajjan's performance has been under the microscope now for, again, a number of months, particularly kicked off when the former military watchdog Gary Wellborn testified at a parliamentary committee that he, of course, had a meeting in person where he tried to alert the defense minister to allegations about then Chief of Defense Staff Jonathan Vance. Then we learned that the Prime Minister's office was aware in 2018 because Harjit Sajjan had informed his Chief of Staff, who then informed the Prime Minister's office, and there was some follow-up after that, and they said they could not find out further information. But the question remains, about Harjit Sajjan's political future, I think, and whether he will, be re-elected in this forthcoming election. Okay,
Kady, who strikes you as being particularly ineffective or a liability in terms of ministers?
Well, despite a last-ditch effort by Carolyn Bennett to capture that title, I will still have to give it to Canadian Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault, simply because the big file he had in the last sitting, which was the broadcasting overhaul, he managed to mangle in so many different ways. Not only did it turn out to be a far more controversial piece of legislation than I think anyone expected because of the last-minute change to remove social media, remove what had been a blanket exception for social media, but he really, when he was criticized, when concerns were raised, he kind of picked a fight over it and then started to, go after people who were criticizing them and really taking an aggressive approach, which I don't think helped him at all. So I found that his inability to sell the bill and his inability to explain why they made that change probably gave the government much more of a headache in the last 2 months or so of Parliament than would otherwise have been the case. Okay,
Tonda, your nomination for most problematic or least well-performing minister.
Well, look, I went with Harjit Sajjan, too. I mean, Harjit Sajjan is the worst performer by a long shot in this government. It has consistently been so over certainly the course of this mandate. And I would argue, actually, there are things that he needs to answer for in the last mandate, too. I think that he is the opposition's exhibit number one for failing to handle the sexual assault issue in the military. And I think that, frankly, he's sort of encapsulates everything there is around all those criticisms you hear about this government being better at words, not action, at not being great at actually implementing its promises. And it has promised for a long time to deal with that issue. And in the 6 years they've been in power, since they had recommendations on exactly how to deal with it, they did not.
Okay, I want to flip the coin, or see the other side of the coin, and ask who you think was the government's best performing and most reliable minister. Kristy.
I chose Chrystia Freeland, of course, the finance minister and the deputy prime minister. Perhaps, that's an easy choice, but I think that Chrystia Freeland is, of course, really relied on in the Trudeau cabinet. And the situation that we're seeing right now is not just a public health emergency, it is a financial crisis. And we will be feeling the economic impacts of COVID-19 for many, many years to come. So I think that Trudeau has leaned on Chrystia Freeland to a great extent before the pandemic, and of course he has leaned on her throughout this pandemic in the way of, again, government supports and ensuring that they have a plan in mind with respect to where they want to go on the economy. So that's why she's my nomination for this category.
Okay, definitely very high profile. Kady, who would you nominate for most effective minister?
I would actually go for Public Services Minister Anita Anand, who is a relatively new addition to the Trudeau cabinet. She just joined in the last election. She wasn't around before that. And she had what turned out to be an incredibly difficult file, because she was sort of the point person in terms of putting all those vaccine contracts together and ensuring that Canada would have the supply. It was sort of fiddly stuff. It wasn't the big picture. You know, if you're the health minister, at least you can go out there and talk about health. If you're other ministers who were involved in sort of that frontline approach had a more tangible thing that they could sort of express as what they were doing, whereas she was kind of doing contract negotiations for months. And I think she actually, as it turned out, did a pretty good job in terms of hammering those out. And when she was called upon by the opposition parties to explain, which happened a couple of times during the House of Commons, the Committee of the Whole sittings that we saw last summer, but also during the last couple of months, she went before various House committees and was questioned over, the fine print of those contracts. And I thought she did a pretty good job of defending herself and of explaining, making the case that the government did perhaps even a better job than, would have been expected, given that we were starting from a position of some weakness, what with not having the domestic manufacturing capacity. So I think that in general, she really seemed to do well on the vaccine procurement. And as a sidebar, she was also, because of, the way her department operates, she was also involved in delivering some of those support programs as well. So I think that, in general, she really performed. She wasn't a high profile minister, but I think she performed really well.
Yeah, definitely in the spotlight and definitely in the thick of it as the vaccines took on such an importance. Tonda, who would you nominate for the most effective or the most reliable minister in the front bench?
I agree with both my colleagues on Freeland and Anand, both very competent ministers, but I went with Carla Qualtrough because I find her to be unflappable, clear, an excellent communicator, and she was responsible for a large frontline department delivering the bulk of the pandemic aid to individuals. And I thought that she has performed remarkably during the whole pandemic, never a fumble really, and so my vote went to her.
Okay, I want to look at the larger issues in terms of issues and how they were handled by the government, because of course as we anticipate a possible election call, the issues are going to be crucial. Let's look at the worst handled issue. What do you think is the worst handled issue for the government? What did it handle badly? Let's start with you, Kristy.
Yeah, I would say that the sexual misconduct issue has definitely dogged the government for a number of months now. And frankly, again, to Tonda's point about the fact that there were recommendations, this was from Marie Deschamps, a former Supreme Court justice, who put forward, the fact that there was an issue of sexual misconduct in the military some 6 years ago now in 2015. And yet this became a huge crisis for the government. There have been a number of survivors coming forward with their stories. We've seen high-ranking military leaders, facing investigations or even having to leave their positions. And I think as far as the government is concerned, they have really not been able to explain why it is that they're now, for example, having another Supreme Court Justice, Louise Arbour, trying to look at the notion of setting up an independent mechanism for survivors to come forward with allegations of sexual misconduct. Again, time. They have been in government for the last 6 years, and they did not follow through with that central call from Marie Deschamps, which was to set up an outside mechanism outside the chain of command for sexual misconduct in the military.
Okay, Kady, what do you think was badly handled, particularly a difficult portfolio or a difficult issue?
I'm kind of going with a more meta issue. It's handling the House of Commons in general and its legislative agenda, because this was a situation where on paper the government did in fact have the support from either the Bloc Québécois or the New Democrats to get a fair chunk of its legislation, at least its mission critical legislation, through the House of Commons at a decent pace, and yet at every opportunity they really seem to squander that. If they weren't sort of allowing these opposition driven filibusters to continue where they could have stopped them by bringing in time allocation or something like that, they were just making weird calls and weird decisions in terms of House management. And it got to the point where it almost seemed as though they wanted some of these bills to be lost or to be stalled or to be stuck for political reasons. And while that might be, something that you might come up with on the campaign trail as a strategy, it certainly isn't something that gives you decent marks for House management. This is, they're in a minority. Yes, that means there's got to be compromises and they're not going to be able to get everything through, but they could have, I think, done a lot better than they did.
Okay, Tonda, what's your nomination?
Look, I went somewhat along the same lines as Kristy, but my take on it was, put it a bit more broadly speaking, harassment in the workplace, toxic workplaces. This government did fail to handle the military question, but they also, remember, failed to handle the Governor General situation. So lousy on dealing with employees and their concerns.
Okay, no, interesting. Okay, so let's now see if that translates, because a badly handled issue during the course of Parliament doesn't necessarily translate into the biggest liability on the election campaign. If the Prime Minister declares an election, calls an election this summer for the late summer or early fall, what do you think will be the biggest liability on the election campaign trail for the government? Let's start with you, Tonda.
Look, I was going to talk about their penchant for complacency in the face of some of these problems we've talked about, or their arrogance in dealing with some of them and the challenges they've gotten from the opposition and their critics. But I think I'd have to land on economic uncertainty, because I think that's the one thing they can't control. I think that they've put in place a lot of things, and that would have been my pick for best, all kinds of pandemic aid dollars to help individuals to cushion the economic and the financial blow. But I think that's the one thing they really still can't fully control. That's a potential liability.
Okay, interesting. Kady, what would you say the risks being the biggest liability as they're out on the campaign trail if they go out?
So I'm gonna sort of go with something that is a perpetual, perennial problem for Liberal parties in general when they've been in government for a little bit of time, and that's the ethics issue. There's enough. It becomes a cumulative issue. Yeah, you've got things like the We Charity controversy, which consumed sort of months and months of time, but then kind of fell out of the headlines. But it added a marker, I think, in the minds of a lot of voters. Then when you have news stories come out that seem to take a similar bent, that's going to kind of add into that list and add into those considerations. I'm not sure. I mean, given that we are coming out of a pandemic, and which will be very fresh off if there is in fact an election this fall, I'm not sure, frankly, if there's going to be much time to talk about or delve into anything but the economic issues and the question of how the government performed in the pandemic. But assuming that there is, I think that the way both the allegations that have been lodged against them, and in some cases confirmed with findings by the ethics commissioner, but also the ham-handed way that the government has handled those allegations in progress when they're kind of trying to defend themselves and making things worse, that's definitely a weak spot for them.
Okay, Kristy, your feelings on what could be a big issue in this election campaign?
I absolutely think the issue of residential schools is going to be in sharp focus during the election, and I think there is the possibility that there could be additional burial sites that are uncovered even during the course of an election campaign. We saw just in the last month or so 2 former residential school sites, unmarked graves that have been brought to the country's attention. This is a horrifying story, and frankly, there's a huge accountability piece. And that is calls from Indigenous leaders for an independent investigation into what happened at Indian residential schools. Those were church run but government-funded institutions that forcibly removed Indigenous children from their families, from their cultures. Murray Sinclair, the former TRC chairman, has called for there to be an investigation. The Prime Minister is expressing some openness to that, but what does that look like And again, that central piece about accountability, because I do think that while the residential school legacy was documented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when it released its report back in 2015, including an emphasis on the existing existence of burial sites, now this is something that is permeating the minds of Canadians as we hear about these stories. And frankly, I think this is the tip of the iceberg with the funding that's been allocated by different levels of government. I think you can only anticipate there are going to be more discoveries. Okay, let's wrap on the last topic, and that is I want to ask you for an opposition party. Choose an opposition party who is up against it. In other words, a big challenge facing one of the opposition parties. I want to start with you, Tonda. If you have to choose an opposition party and what its biggest challenge is if the election's called.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say the Conservative Party, and its biggest challenge is Erin O'Toole's invisibility, near invisibility to Canadians. I feel that since he's been elected leader of the party, he has failed to have a constructive impact on many national issues. I think he, within his own party, faces huge challenges. He hasn't united it yet. His signature carbon pricing policy was seen by his base as a reversal, and it's not guaranteed to win him votes in urban Canada, where he might hope to grow the party. And so overall, I think he's aligned himself with unpopular provincial premiers who've seen their popularity decline, and I think he's got a huge hill to climb in this election. Okay, we're going to go to you, Kristy. What party are you looking for, and what a party that's really up against a big challenge if the election's called?
Yeah, I'm going to echo a lot of what Tonda said with respect to the Conservatives and essentially the ability for Erin O'Toole to resonate with Canadians, because I absolutely agree with Tonda that issue of the fact that he hasn't really resonated is a real problem for him personally and for the Conservatives. And of course, in the last election in 2019, under a different leader, under Andrew Scheer, the Conservatives had a very disappointing showing. They were hoping that they would be able to form government. That didn't happen, and yet some 2 years later, with a new leader, the Conservatives are still fighting to try and turn things around and to try and get out of opposition and to be competitive in the way of trying to form government. And I think, frankly, the Liberals are hoping that Erin O'Toole continues not to resonate so they can look at forming a majority should they head back to the polls, whether it's this summer or into the fall. Okay, Kady, last word to you. What are you looking for? What's interesting to you?
Well, I agree. I echo what my colleagues say about the Conservative. That's going to be fascinating to watch unfold. But I'd also like to suggest that the party leader who I think right now is under the most direct and critical challenge of actually being removed from that position is, of course, Annamie Paul of the Greens. And that's why I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on what goes on both over the summer in terms of this ultimatum she's under from the Federal Council to basically redeclare her alliance to the caucus and repudiate her former advisor. Does that happen? Does it not? Is there a leadership review? Does the Green Party, even if she does keep the job until, a still theoretical upcoming election, this is a real make or break test for the Green Party, I think. If she's not able to show, significant gains, which when you have, 2 seats now, I would say unless she is able to come back with maybe 5, 6, 7, edging in on official party status, it's going to be really difficult for her to remain more than a single election. I think that in that sense, she isn't going to get the same grace period that Elizabeth May did, who was able to kind of keep being the leader for, election after election without winning any seats.
Okay, well, listen, the three of you, absolutely wonderful. I want to wish you a happy and quiet summer, and we'll see what happens. Thanks for sharing your reflections.
Thanks, Martin. Have a good summer, everybody.